The time has therefore come when we must present a common front backed by a common power. The free world cannot continue to negotiate from weakness or unpreparedness, and with the most heartfelt desire to make an end of war, we must be ready to meet it if it comes.
This has got to be one of the most anticipated episodes of the series. To many, Menzies is the great titan of Australian politics, and to others, he's seen as a Palpatine figure who had a stranglehold on Parliament in the middle of the 20th century. The Menzies episode certainly has everything: controversy, war, and even spies. So we left last week with Ben Chifley's Labor losing to Menzies' Liberals in the 1949 election. What I didn't mention was that Ben Chifley continued in opposition until he actually unexpectedly died of a heart attack in 1951. This is significant because Chifley himself was a titan of the 1940s, and Menzies' opponent was now Herbert Evatt, a brilliant academic, but one who lacked the appeal to the common Australian that the train driver Chifley had. What was also really important was that there was no one really within the Liberals who could rival Menzies. The reappointment of 80-year-old Billy Hughes as the party leader in the early 1940s was a sign of desperation, and so when Menzies took back control of the party, he was very secure. Now, in 1948, the year before he defeated Chifley, Menzies visited England and was horrified at the communist coup in Czechoslovakia that had taken place earlier in the year. As a result, on the campaign trail, Menzies campaigned on the banning of the Australian Communist Party. It had never held a seat in federal parliament and only held one seat in Queensland's parliament, but this was the late 40s and Cold War paranoia was very high. Things were made worse when in 1950, Kim Il-sung's communist regime in the north crossed the 38th parallel and invaded Syngman Rhee's South Korea. Menzies pledged military assistance, with 17,000 Australians ultimately serving in the Korean War, but more still, Alan Martin argues that Menzies believed Australia had just 3 years to prepare for a Third World War. So Menzies got straight to work in trying to ban the Communist Party in Australia. Now, his first attempt fell flat in its face as it couldn't even get through a Liberal-controlled parliament. The second attempt, however, successfully got through the parliament, but the Communist Party took Menzies to the High Court. Menzies argued that the Constitution's guarantee of freedom of political association was forfeited because the Communist Party held to Marx's teaching of revolution, and they were therefore committed to sedition. The High Court rejected this though, saying that the courts, and not the executive, that's the Prime Minister and their cabinet, had the right to determine who was guilty of sedition and who was not. So there was no hope of banning the Communist Party, right? Well, not at all, and Menzies wasn't deterred. Menzies decided that the next course of action was to have a referendum. That's a proposal to change the Constitution. In 1951, all Australians had to either vote yes or no to this proposal. Do you approve of the proposed law for the alteration of the Constitution entitled Constitution Alteration, Powers to Deal with Communists and Communism, 1951? Now, as we've said in earlier episodes, referendums are only successful if a majority of states vote yes. For this referendum, 3 states voted yes, that was Queensland, Western Australia and Tasmania, but 3 states also voted no, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia, meaning that there wasn't a majority and the Communist Party survived by the skin of their teeth. It's also worth noting that Labor campaigned on a no vote. But Menzies' assault on the communists wasn't done there, because in 1954, news broke of the scandalous Petrov affair. Now, Aussie students, most of you would have covered this in Year 10 history. We were taught it at my school, but to be honest, I was pretty preoccupied by opening packs on the Ultimate Team web app, hence why my students never get away with trying the same thing. By the way, none of you guys guessed my Premier League team last episode, so I'll give you another shot this week. But essentially, Vladimir and Evdokia Petrov were Soviet spies sent by the Soviet security chief, Lavrentiy Beria. However, when Stalin died in 1953, Beria was then arrested by the new government and the Petrovs were fearful of a return to Russia. ASIO then offered them political asylum in return for providing evidence of espionage, and in 1954, literally just before the election, Menzies announced to Parliament that the Soviet spies had been captured. And this was kind of a nudge and a wink to the Australian voters, basically saying, hey, I was the one who wanted to take action on the communists back in 1951, and Labor wanted to protect them. Now that we've caught the Soviet spies, who do you want protecting you? In response, just before the 1954 elections, Labor's Herbert Evatt accused Menzies of conspiring with ASIO to force a defection just before the election. And what was a pretty terrible PR move, Evatt wrote to the Soviet foreign minister asking if the allegations of espionage were true, and he denied them. Evatt then read this letter of denial out to Parliament to much ridicule. Evatt's communication with the Soviets only enforced the public perception that Labor was weak on communism. This also led to the Labor left, Labor right split. Supporters of Everett fell onto the Labour left side, while supporters of the Catholic anti-communist B.A. Santa Maria came to support Labour right. This huge factional division would contribute to Menzies remaining in power for so long. Now, full disclosure, it was really hard to get the script down to under 15 minutes on this one. 16 years of Menzies really warrants a full podcast length episode, and plans have begun for a 2023 podcast, but I need your support to make it happen. Essentially, we need to get a sound kit to support co-hosts, and 50 patrons will get us there. Join for just $1.50 for all sorts of bonuses, including a face reveal, contributions to episodes, and even selecting episode topics. We appreciate all the support we get. Now, by and large, Menzies wanted to retain the Department of Post-War Reconstruction that Chifley had earlier set up. Essentially, this department dealt with infrastructure projects and training schemes for returning soldiers. Menzies agreed with Chifley that the military needed to be fairly demobilised. Menzies also founded the National Security Resources Board, which he himself chaired, and the board basically supervised the stockpiling of weapons for a potential Third World War. However, by the early 1950s, post-war inflation had grown fairly rampantly, and Menzies needed to halt it. Essentially, in 1951, Menzies announced the horror budget, in which the top marginal tax rate for incomes over £10,000 was 75%. The inflation of the early 50s also resulted in a huge trade deficit, as the cost of labour made foreign markets much more appealing than Australia's. Menzies asked businesses to have voluntary restraint from imports and began to place import restrictions. For a brief moment in the 50s, Australia looked like it would go back to the free trade versus protectionist division of the 1900s. However, with prosperity came support for the Menzies regime, and in 1958 he led the Liberals to the biggest ever election win, winning 77 seats to 45. Though he didn't step down straight away, this effectively killed Herbert Everett as opposition leader. During the 1950s, Menzies also introduced the National Capital Development Bill, transferring the military from Melbourne to Canberra, and building new schools, homes and services to support the government's operations being based in the capital. However, by the 1960s, the inflation issue hadn't been solved, and Menzies' treasurer, Harold Holt, continued with deflationary measures such as a sales tax on motor vehicles and restrictions on bank loans. At the same time, Menzies also continued the expansion of the Snowy Mountains scheme. When elections came around in 1961, the Libs scraped through to 62 seats to 60. Menzies' next few years would be amongst his most pivotal. So my subscriber question today is this: depending on your political persuasion, Menzies' longevity in office usually has him regarded as either the best or worst Prime Minister in Australia's history. Where do you think he ranks on that spectrum? By the way, if you're liking this video so far, do make sure to hit that like button. It helps us beat Sky News and ABC News on the algorithm. Now, as the preview suggested, I'm going to do a little section on Menzies' attitude towards white Australia, because I do think it's really important. So Menzies was a huge British loyalist, and he went to England nearly every year. He progressively became more and more disillusioned as more colonies gained independence, and by the end of the 1950s, white states were outnumbered in the Commonwealth. Menzies had just assumed that the Pacific colonies would be returned to the colonial owners after the war, but the 1950s saw a wave of Asian and Middle Eastern independence. The perfect example of this was the Suez Crisis of 1956. Essentially, the British-backed King of Egypt, Farouk I, was overthrown by the nationalist President Nasser earlier in 1952. In 1956, Nasser nationalised the canal, meaning the new Egyptian Republic had total control over the main shipping route between the Mediterranean and Indian Oceans. Menzies led an international mission to persuade Nasser into signing a treaty with the UN. However, talks broke down when Eisenhower said that the US would not actually use force against the Egyptians. When the French and British bombed Egypt, Menzies actually had a choice. He didn't have to support the UK because the US had said that they were pretty chill about what Nasser was doing, but being a strong believer in the Anglosphere, Menzies came out in support of the bombings. In terms of immigration, Menzies was also a strong believer in the White Australia policy, but to support the expanding economy, Australia needed more migrants than it was getting from Europe. Ultimately, Menzies settled for migrants from Turkey and the Middle East, who he viewed as completely uncivilized. This snobbery towards East Asia would prove pivotal in his final years of office. So by 1965, Australia was well and truly in the Vietnam War, which became extremely controversial. But if you follow the footsteps of Menzies back through the 50s and 60s, his decision to support America really wasn't all that surprising. In 1954, Australia signed the SEATO alliance with America, which was not just a Southeast Asian alliance, but was primarily focused on the defense of Malaya, which was deemed as a crucial defense point. Now, by 1962, America had troops on the ground in Vietnam to support the South Vietnamese government. Menzies responded positively to this, but didn't commit soldiers right away. However, in 1964, the president of Indonesia, Sukarno, opposed the formation of Malaysia, a merger of Malaya, Singapore, and Borneo. His confrontation policy saw him use military force to oppose the merger. As a result, Australia supported the new Malaysia while the Soviets supported Sukarno. This was the first time Australian troops were in combat with Indonesian troops, and 23 Australians were killed. In 1966, Indonesia ultimately accepted Malaysia. But this set the stage for November of 1964, when Menzies announced compulsory national service in the army for men turning 20 in 1965, who had to do 2 years of full-time service. And so this was the third time the conscription debate rolled around, and Labor came out in strong opposition to it. I actually recently met a veteran who was conscripted yet was supportive of the war, but he said the conscription policy was really unpopular, and it's not surprising why. Conscription was opposed during World War I when the nation by and large believed in the war, let alone for stopping an independent government 5,000 kilometers away. Menzies was a big believer in the idea of forward defense, basically the idea that communism had to be stopped north of Malaya. So in 1965, Menzies sent a battalion over to support America, and so by the end of the year, Australia was well and truly in Vietnam. However, just weeks later on Australia Day of 1966, Menzies resigned from office. The timing was really surprising, but no one could question his titanic status, winning 7 straight elections with only really 3 of them in doubt. But with Menzies gone, a new Liberal had to step into the hot seat, and that man was Harold Holt. So Holt was in, and in the next episode, it is going to get really messy for a whole lot of reasons. You might just be afraid of jumping in the water. If you did enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and let me know below how Menzies ranks on the Prime Minister tier list. Also, check out our Patreon and consider supporting a future podcast for just $1.50 a month. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.